Here are the concepts we're going to cover. Homing. To execute a homing cycle, you just type $H in the command line. You press enter. What's going to happen when you do that is it's going to raise up in the Z direction. It's going to contact your Z homing switch. It's going to back off. In our case, we use a 4mm back off. It's going to back off the switch 4mm, then come back into it very slowly to get an accurate position. So it triggers that switch at just the same exact position every time. Then it's going to move fairly quickly in the X and Y directions simultaneously towards those homing switches. It's going to contact those, back off 4mm, come back into the switches very slowly, and then back off 4mm, and then wait for a new command. Okay, you need to run a homing cycle to take advantage of most of these concepts that you see listed here. So let's just delve right in and talk about the concepts, what they are, and how you use them. G28 and G30 are home positions. Now you could think of them as places that you just want to park the machine. You should not be thinking of these as the place where the homing switches are. It could be if you set it up that way. But if you were to run a homing cycle and then just give a G28 command, it's not going to go back to where those switches are unless you've set that up with a G28.1 command. So what you'll do is you would jog the machine over to a particular position and you would issue it. Let's say I want to come here. Now notice that I'm looking here at my work coordinate positions, and these are my machine coordinate positions. I'm not actually connected to a machine right now. This is just running off a controller sitting on my desk. So don't get too wrapped around the positions themselves. I'm going to go and turn verbose output off. And let's say I wanted this position in machine space, where I'm at in machine space, negative 13x, negative 5y, negative 0.6z. Let's say I wanted that to be my G28 position. I would type in G28.1 and enter. And then, if I were to move somewhere else, and so it went somewhere else, if I type in G28, it's going to return to that position that I set as a G28 position. The same applies for the G30 command. Now the G91 G28Z0, this is tricky, so you need to pay close attention. You have to have it just like this. If you just type in G28Z0 thinking it's going to go to that 0 point that you've set for the Z with a G28.1, you're going to be mistaken. It's going to do something different. You can experiment and see what I mean, but just know that if you want it to lift up to that Z level that you specified as your G28 position, you need to use G91 G28Z0. You also need to keep in mind, after using this G91 command, you're now switched over to incremental motion commands. So if you're in absolute G90 and then you type this command in, now you're going to be in incremental. So if you want to move in absolute terms, you need to switch back to G90 by just typing G90 in the command line, typing enter. Now G53 is going to access the machine coordinate system. Now what that means, let me switch back here. We've got our work coordinate system and our machine coordinate system. And the difference between the two, the machine coordinate system is where your machine is relative to the homing switches. Your work coordinate system is where it is relative to the origin of that work system that you specified. So if I want to move to a particular space in machine space, I'm going to use the G53 command. G53, let's say I want to move to negative 50 to X negative 50, Y negative 50, Z negative 10 in machine space relative to my homing switch positions. I will type this in and then hit enter. See, it's going to travel negative 50, negative 50, negative 10 in machine coordinates. Now, One thing to know about this G53 command is it is non-modal. So that means that the G53 command only persists for that one line that I'm issuing it on. So if I were to type in X -5, Y -5, you might think that you're actually going to move to -5 here and -5 here, but instead you're going to move to -5 in your work coordinate system. So that could give you some trouble if you don't pay attention to the fact that G53 is a non-modal command, meaning it will only be in effect for this one line that you're issuing the motion command on. All right. I keep talking about these work coordinate systems. So what are they? All right, you've got the G54 through G59 coordinate systems. And the idea behind this is that you can set up different positions on your machine to run work off of. So you'll see in the example later, I've got a vise set up on the Carve King, and I'm going to set up G54 and G55 origins as different corners of the fixed jaw of that vise. And then I could run work relative to those origins. So I would keep in mind when I set my G-code file up, when I'm doing my cam setup, what I'm calling is the origin. So if I were to use the back left of my vise, and say my fixed jaw is right, let's pretend that this is my vise space here. If I were to use the back left as the origin, I would need to make sure I set up in cam that my part is getting run here and that the origin in the cam setup isn't here, or else it's going to reference this point here as the origin and then try and run machine work up here where you see my mouse moving around. That'll make more sense when we get out on the machine. So how do you set up one of these work coordinate systems? How do you set up the origin? You're going to use the G10 command. All right, so you select that work system by G54 or G55, whichever system you want to select, but you actually designate where that origin is in machine space using the G10 command. All right, so what you want to do if you're going to set up the origin for the G54 system, let's say I want to call the exact spot that my end mill is right now. I want to call that the origin of the G54 system. I would type in G10, L20, P1, X0, Y0, Z0. The P1 is going to be used to designate which coordinate system you're talking about. P1 talks about G54, P2 sets G55, P3 would set G56, P4 would set G57, and so on. Unless you're on a production machine running production, you're probably only going to be working with a couple different coordinate systems if you just got clamping jigs set up in particular positions. Now, as an alternative, you can use the G92 command. Let's say you don't have homing switches at all, and you just want to say, hey, where the machine is at right now, I want to call the origin. I want to call this a 0 point because I've set up the end mill. I've moved the end mill over relative to the piece of wood or piece of aluminum that I'm working on. I've moved it where I need it to be, and I just need to zero the machine out. You can type in G92, X0, Y0, Z0, and press enter. Notice that 0 is my work coordinates here. That'll make more sense when we get out on the machine. I don't always use the G10 command to set up a work origin. That's mainly just done one time when I'm setting up on a fixture such as a clamping jig or a vise. If I'm just running a quick part that I set up randomly in my machine space, I'm going to use my G92 command to just zero the machine out real quick relative to that part and get to rocking and rolling on making it. So I hope that is a good introduction to the commands. It's going to make a lot more sense when we get out to the machine and you actually see the machine move once these commands are issued. So I'll see you guys out there.
Okay guys, here we are out at the machine. Got the Carve King here. Now for the record, this Carve King is in starboard. This is something that I'm experimenting with to see if it's something that I want to offer for sale. So far so good. Looks like a great option, looks great, very durable. You could spray lubricants on it and wipe it right up. So moving on to what we wanted to talk about. Again, we're going to go over the practical application of our work offsets and homing, setting home positions, going to those home positions, etc. So let's start with a home cycle. You can see that you execute that with the $H command into the console. Now before I hit this, what the machine's going to do is move up in Z, move down, move back into Z slowly, then move in the X and Y direction toward those homing switches, contact those switches, move back, then move back into them slowly. Watch what happens. Here it's contacted the Z and it's slowly moving back into the Z switch to get an accurate position. Now it's moving in X and Y simultaneously. It contacted the Y switch, so it stopped. It contacted the X switch, then X and Y at the same time backed off 4 millimeters. That's how we have it set. All right, that completed a homing cycle. Now, what I want to show you guys on the screen is that my work position is 313 in X, 96 in Y, 39.22 in Z. But you see it's -4, -4, -4 in machine coordinates. Now why is that? Because the homing switches were backed off. We backed 4 millimeters off the homing switches, so we weren't just sitting right on that switch contacting it. Now, I've already set up the G54 work position to be this back right corner of this vise. Now, this isn't really a machine vise. This is just a inexpensive drill press, low profile vise that you can pick up from Home Depot or Lowe's, really cheap. Now again, I've set up my G54 system to be the back right corner. You might want to have the vise flipped around. I like this orientation because I can work it very easily from here, from the front of the machine. So I'm going to move G54 X0 Y0, and you're going to see it's going to traverse to right over this point. Okay, now if I go to Z 0.1, it's going to, it came to 0.1 millimeter from the top of this vise surface. So you might want to ask, how did I set that up? Okay, let's say, just for example, we want to now set up the G55 system to be this back left. Okay, so let's get there. We're going to jog the machine over there. I want to bring the Z up to a safe height to make sure that I'm not going to drag across anything. We shouldn't, because we were 0.1 millimeter above this surface, but just to be sure, we're going to lift it up to be clear. And I'm just going to jog over. All right, just those few jogs put me about where I need to be. Now, if I wanted to actually dial this in, I would use my feeler gauge to approach each corner and then use the appropriate offset given the tool diameter. You could also run a probing cycle that's currently kind of working in Universal G-Code Center. You can watch another video on that. But the point is, I'm now going to call the top of this corner here, with the end mill centered over it, the origin of the G55 system. So what I would want to do to make sure that I'm at an accurate position from the surface is I'm going to take my feeler gauge. You can also take a sheet of paper, which is about 4 thou or 0.1 millimeter, a sheet of notebook paper, and use that. Not as accurate as a feeler gauge though. And all I'm going to do is just jog the machine down. Here I'm 1.1 millimeter away from the surface on my digital readout. my work position system. And I knew that I'm 1.1 over here, so I ought to be very close to that here. I may not be because I didn't take a lot of care or time throwing this vise on the table. But here we're going to sneak up on that position by moving down 0.1 millimeter at a time. And I'm going to just put my feeler gauge underneath it. And there we go. My feeler gauge is starting to drag underneath the end mill, between the end mill and the top of this vise. So I actually am 0.1 millimeter from here. So how are we going to set this up as the G55 system? I'm going to use the G10 command. So here we'll type G10 L20 P2. Now we used P2 because we're using this to set up the G55 work coordinate system. I used P1 earlier before I started the video to set up the G54 system as this point, using this point as the origin. I'm going to set up the G55 system, so I'm using the P2 command. So G10 L20 P2 X0 Y0. That's telling it no offset from the current position for X and Y. For Z, I knew with my feeler gauge I'm 0.1 millimeter above that surface. So I'll tell it Z0.1. So G10 L20 P2 X0 Y0 Z0.1. Now if I select the G55 system, you see my digital readout has changed to show X0, Y0, Z0.1. So if I were to send a G-code file now, I would want to make sure that that file has as its origin the back left of the part, and giving me room for the jaws to make sure I don't actually contact anything there as I'm cutting out the part. But let's move on to another concept. That covers G10. So what if you don't have homing switches and you just want to set up a quick origin? Here I'm going to throw just a 4x4 on here. The Carve King will actually machine a 4x4. It fits underneath there. Let's say this little knot right here. Let's say I want to set that as the origin of my work system. I just want to create a temporary work system. Maybe I don't have homing switches, or maybe for whatever reason I didn't want to take the time to home the machine. So we'll use the G92 command to set up a temporary offset. Now one trick I can use here is I'm not exactly sure how much I can lift Z if I'm just thinking in terms of the work coordinate system. But I know in terms of my machine coordinates that 0 is going to be all the way up touching this switch. So if I were to give it a G53 Z -3 command, that's going to move up just below the switch. So that's 3 millimeters underneath where that switch contacts. So that's going to allow me to clear my workspace. I'm going to make sure that I don't hit anything in my workspace with my tool. So here I can just jog the machine over using the jog controls. And again, we're shooting for this knot. We won't worry about a lot of precision here. We're just going to try and get close. Okay, now I'm going to take my feeler gauge again, and I'm going to move the tool down until I'm just above that, until I'm just barely pinching the feeler gauge between the end mill and the wood. Here I'm getting close, so I'm going to reduce my step size to 0.1 millimeter and start working my feeler gauge in there. that's about it. I could get even more accurate and go to a 0.01 millimeter step. The Carve King has that much resolution where it can move 0.01 millimeter at a time. It even has more resolution than that. But if I wanted to, I could get it just exact. But let's just call this 0.1 millimeter above the stock because that's the size of my feeler gauge. So again, if I just wanted to use the G92 command to set up a quick origin, I would type G92 X0, Y0, Z0.1. Now why did I do Z0.1? A lot of times we'll just tell you, give it a G92 X0, Y0, Z0. Well, remember I used my feeler gauge and it had a thickness of 0.1 millimeter. So we're gonna pick up with G28 and learn about it. I've just homed the machine, so it is 4 millimeters from each homing switch. That's something that we have set in the firmware where it's going to back off 4 millimeters. Let's say I want to set the G28 position back over here. Since I've just homed, I can use the G53 command to address machine coordinates specifically and move to an exact position in machine space. Now I know that if I come over here at say 415 millimeters from the X switch, then I'm still going to have plenty of room to the left. So let's do that. I'm going to type in G53 X negative 415. And it's going to move to 415 millimeters from the X-axis homing switch. Now let's say that I'm happy with that being my G28 position. All I have to do is type in G28.1, enter. Now it's going to remember anytime I give it a G28 command, as long as I've homed the machine, to come back to this position. Now if I were to turn the machine on and I didn't home it, it doesn't know where it's at in machine space. In Universal G-Code Center, it's going to assume that it's at 000 when you first start the machine in machine space. That's obviously not going to be correct, so you need to home the machine before you use the G28 command. Now, even though you may never want to actually set up G28 for what you do, I do recommend setting it up because in Autodesk Fusion 360 using the Gerbil post processor, there is an option for writing G28 to the G-code or not. If you mess around and select yes, or you don't change it to no, and then you don't go in and delete it from that G-code, there's going to be a G28 command written towards the top of that G-code, and it's going to try and come to the G28 position wherever it may be set in the controller if you don't already have it set to something specific. So this will kind of help you out there. Something else that I want to demonstrate with G28 is, let's say that I want to come, we're going to go to a position in our coordinate system now. We were in the G54 system, and I came to the XY0 of the G54 system. Now, let's say that I am down, we're going to jog the machine down, and I type G28 here. It's going to move directly in X, Y, and Z to that G28 position. Now, what if I were down into this vise, below this jaw? Say the end mill was right here. Let's move it a little closer. So now the end mill would collide with this jaw of the vise if I were to just give it a G28 command. What I can do here is type in G91 G28 Z0, and it's going to lift to the level that I have for set for the G28 position. So it lifted to that Z level that corresponds to my G28 position. From here, I could give it the G28 command, and that'll keep me from colliding if I'm down into a pocket or if I'm down into a fixture. Now, the G30 command would be set the same way, just substitute G30 for everything I said G28 for. Now, one thing I want to make you aware of is we just used the G91 command to moved that Z up to the G28 Z level. Now that I am in G91, I'm in incremental. If I were to type, say, Y-5, you might be expecting that I would come right here because this is Y0 for the G54 system. If I were to come to Y-5, I would be just beyond that. But because I'm in incremental, it's just going to move 5 millimeters. So I need to switch back to absolute by giving it a G90 command, and then I can move back to where I want. So this is G28, G30, your work offsets. That's it in a nutshell. This was a lot of information. You're probably going to want to watch this video a couple of times and practice it on your machine to make sure that you've understood the concept. Leave me some comments. Let me know if you've got any questions, and I'll see what I can do for you. Thanks.